meeste navorsers en dosente. Baie interessante werk wat hy doen oor die verband tussen die tradisionele wêreld en die moderne wêreld. Ullrich is opgeleide en natuurlik nou afgetree, maar hy het gewerk as Lutherse pastoor ook. Maar Ullrich, jy het ook 'n belangstelling van baie lankal af in die gesprek tussen geestelike tradisies, waaroor jou navorsing en jou proefskrif ook gaan. Jy is ook self iemand wat 'n goeie kennis het van yoga, en jy is ook iemand met 'n baie groot liefde vir die ortodokse tradisie in die Christendom, né? Dit is min of meer as 'n soort vertrekpunt waar uit jou teses gekom het. Is ek reg as ek dit sê?
Ja, zeker toch.
Ja, goed.
En mens mag nog bijvoegen dat ik wel met theologie ook Duitse literatuur studeer het en daarvoor al die gedachten van die romantisme en later romantisme. En daar is al een antwoord op die post-seculiere situatie voorbereid.
Ja.
Dat in de 20e eeuw nog gebloeid het en na die einde en die beperkingen van die rationalistische en seculaire wereld van die Enlightenment-tijd, afkleringstijd. En dat is ook een van die punten wat mij naar die orthodoxie toe gaat trekken.
Ja.
Die heel klare beseftenis dat daar wel iets is wat naar ons postseculiere situatie wel spreekt,
Ja.
als filosofisch en ook met die yoga verbonden.
Ja. Miskien as ek net iets kan sê vir die kykers van hierdie opname wat nie noodwendig so goed ingewerk is op die vrae wat ons vandag oor gesels nie. Terwyl dit vir baie lank aanvaar is dat sekularisasie in die westerse wêreld eintlik die norm sou word en dat dit ook in ander wêrelddele sou plaasvind, is dit vandag eintlik glad nie meer aanvaar nie. Daar word toenemend, soos jy gesê het, gepraat van 'n postsekulêre wêreld waarin daar baie interessante dinkwerk gedoen word oor die religie. En miskien kan ek ook net vir die luisteraars iets vertel wat my getref het toe ek in die jaar Julie 2018 het ek op die ortodokse kloosterberg wat al 1000 jaar ononderbroke bewoon word, het ek besoek afgelê en ek onthou wat my in 'n stadium daar skielik net stap op die berg en toe sê ek vir die vriend, hier staan die mythos en die logos nie in spanning met mekaar nie. So dis 'n tipies, kom ek sê, jy het nou verwys na die afklering, die verligtingstradisie, die filosofie van Immanuel Kant, wat sterf in 1804, om te sê dat daar is 'n soort spanning tussen die rasionele en die mitiese, en dat ons besig is om 'n sogenaamd mitiese wêreld agter te laat, op pad te gaan na 'n rasionele wêreld waarin die wetenskap vir ons eintlik alle vrae moet beantwoord. En die soort van ding, weet ons nou vandag, is nie so eenvoudig nie. En die werk wat jy gedoen het vir jou doktorale proefskrif, gaan eintlik dieper in die goed in. Maar Ullrich, kom ons begin, and I think we agreed to also give perhaps a greater audience access to our conversation that will continue henceforth in English, because in my view also, as not only a professor of philosophy but also an Orthodox priest myself, I think what you've done in your thesis genuinely has very interesting consequences far outside the Afrikaans world. So, you developed an interest in hesychasm, the Orthodox tradition of silent prayer. Could you perhaps just, for somebody who's never heard of hesychasm and as someone who came to it from outside the Orthodox world, just say a bit about what is hesychasm, how old is the tradition, what happens in hesychasm before we go to the relationship to yoga and New Platonism?
Well, gladly do so. Maybe to build a bridge from the introductory words in Afrikaans to the continuation and the answer to your question, there's a fun concept in modern Afrikaans poetry of the kar. En ons sit in die kar van sekularisasie.
Ja.
En ons is bewus geword
K-A-A-R.
Nee, soos die kar van Stellenbosch of waar ook.
Ja.
En ons sit in die kar van sekularisasie en die Frankfurter Schule, is nog in Frankfurt, het bewus geword dat die verligtingstradisie selfs mities is.
Ja.
die eis om rationeel te wees, is 'n mythos van die moderne.
Presies.
In die postsekulêre wêreld het dit nog begin te besef.
Ja,
En die heel boeiende ding is, en nou gaan ek aan met Engels, is dat alreeds die filosofische basis van hesychasme al bewustzijn daarvan heeft dat daar iets van hyper rationaliteit is wat transcendent is. Zonder daar die transcendente aspect is rationaliteit een mythos. Now we'll continue in English.
sure.
And it's an insight of the 20th century and its research into the limitations of secularism, that this is mythical itself. It's thinking in the closed circuits. And we see the daily results of it. People drink, take drugs, even academic people deep in drugs, engage in all sorts of extreme sorts of spirituality, going to the darker shades of whatever, fascination of something authoritarian, and at the same time a dreadful, like in the thrall of death, squeeze out of life whatever there is and then to drop off into death. It's a very dark mood that has secular people in its hold.
Yeah.
Sometimes drawn to the fringes of whatever may be considered spiritual in the darker aspects of it, whatever. Now, hesychasm arose out of late Platonist traditions, and they had an engagement with the superficial hedonism and rationality of the antique world, and knew there is no salvation, no light in this. And drawing on Plato, they realized there is something of a transcendental light that illuminates ourselves when we try to strive for that which is reasonable in a deeper sense.
Yeah.
And this creates a certain sense of hermeneutics. A hermeneutics that is to be found in the thought of late idealism, that there is a distinction between our own rational self and the transcendental self that we have to posit for our own rational self to work.
Yeah.
So which may lead us beyond the limitations of our known world, because otherwise we'd just be in a cage like Sartre described in Huis Clos, in the closed house.
Yes.
It's hell. It is reality, the totality, and a keyword of rationalism is totality. And there's little wonder that the secular age of 20th century is also an age of totalitarianisms of the most evil sort, of different shades. And hesychism tries to find pathways out of this.
Yeah.
And
so hesychism as the tradition of silent prayer in the Orthodox tradition, already in its time, reacts to the limits of reason.
Exactly.
It's not a new thing that we see in our time. The word hesychasm, it comes from
hesychia, calmness, silence. That can mean inner silence, inner calmness. It can also mean outer, an environment of stillness.
Yes.
So that the mind can become quiet, can enter itself, and by entering itself, of course, one is confronted with the demons and the shades of their own soul.
Yes.
The darkness is the drives that drive us to this and that and whatever, and to create calmness. And in this calmness, both the deeper recesses and deeper elements of ourselves can surface, maybe things of beauty and warmth and spirituality that may be buried there, and then also something divine emerges. So you described a hike to, I believe it was Mount Athos, the prime site of hesychast tradition, and the foremost theoretician of hesychism, the 14th century philosopher theologian Gregory Palamas, described Mount Athos as situated in the borderland of heaven and earth.
Yes.
Which is not a pious. It is pious, but it's not. It's not merely a mythological religious concept. It describes very precisely what the Neoplatonists also described, to get to that point where our own reason opens up to something transcendental, which cannot be grasped purely, but which can manifest itself in bodily experiences, in transformation, in the aspect of soul and of mind.
Yeah.
And that leads us to a structural foundation that the worldview of Platonism, Neoplatonism, and the anthropology are three-tiered, and the psychoanalytic three-tiered concept of the human being, of a mind, body, and the intermediate realm of psyche or soul, with the psychosomatic connections, all that goes back to this tradition. So this may be an indication of its modernity, and Hesychism addresses or describes way of accessing this transcendental in all three tiers. And that was controversial, and it's also modern. It's not only about thought to come to ever further expanses, but it is also an aesthetic, an experience of emotions, of beauty, of the soul, whatever soul is, and also bodily transformation, and there it links up with yoga, definitely.
Now we'll get back to this three-tiered structure that you refer to as mind, body, and soul, because it's of course very interesting that some of the key pioneers of modern psychology, like Carl Gustav Jung, like Sigmund Freud, also refer to this three-tiered structure. And I think one needs to stress that we're talking here of a tradition in the Orthodox branch of Christianity that is very old, but that has always sought to integrate the rational, the affective, and the physical, something like that. But before we get to that, so the research that you did for your thesis took seriously a very old idea. And this old idea is that there is some link between the roots of hesychasm. I mean, if one looks at the New Testament, there are in the Gospels numerous references to Christ, for example, retiring into the desert and praying silently for 40 days, as one example. But there's been this recognition for a long time in the Orthodox tradition that there's a link between hesychast prayer, hesychast meditation, and the tradition of yoga. And the line that you draw in your research is to say that you think originally we know that the Greeks and the Romans had huge regard for India and for the Indian tradition. And there was some sort of contact between the new Platonist philosophers, so those would be the philosophers inheriting the school of Plato, but working roughly, we could say, between the 2nd and 3rd until about the 5th, 6th century. And during this period, you argue that these new Platonist philosophers made contact with yogis in India, or from India, and eventually this then again, through Neoplatonism, found space in the Orthodox tradition. Can you just tell our viewers a bit about this, the yogis, Neoplatonists to the Orthodox, how that line works?
It's quite remarkable that Alexander the Great was well aware that he was writing history as he fought his battles with the Persian Empire, and that
and his campaign is about 325 before Christ.
Yes.
Yeah, Alexander the Great. Right.
And he had a staff of learned people around him, historiographers, philosophers, and so on, to accompany him. And when they finally arrived at the eastern fringes of the Persian Empire and the western of India, there they found the Greeks, whom the Persians had banned there, who could act as interpreters, and they were adamant and keen to meet Brahmanic yogins. And this is the key partner. They're the key partners who were sought for centuries by Greeks, Brahmanic yogins, which means they practiced yoga, but they were also learned in the Upanishad traditions, in Vedanta, in Brahmanic philosophy, which is a spiritual and religious philosophy. And it's this combination that
that's the important thing. It is in Greek philosophy the search for scholars, but also meditation practitioners in India that integrated the best of their contemplative tradition and of their philosophy.
And this reminds us also that Greek philosophers were not only people who thought and wrote, but who also engaged in forms of spirituality, with oral traditions, with schools, with living exchange, with common search to put their philosophy into practice, which was by necessity transcendental, because it also links with the divine source of every any
Yeah,
rationality.
and that's a sort of research I think Pierre Hadot, the French Jesuit, brought to our attention in the past 60, 70, 80 years, that in all ancient Greek and Roman schools, you had a philosophy as a way of life, and then a discourse about that way of life, but that it was underpinned also by the philosophers teaching their students in various schools a variety of spiritual practices. And these could be from keeping a diary to reflecting on the past day, but also to breathing exercises. There's, for example, Hadot points out in, I think it's in the Symposium, the dialogue of Plato, before Socrates goes into the banquet hall, he stops to concentrate on his breath. I'm paraphrasing now, but it's very clear that he stood for a moment still to breathe deeply. So the Greeks were aware of this. Alexander goes on his campaign to India, Persia, and India, and deliberately with his learned circle reach out to Brahmanic yogis in India. Okay. What happens from there to Neoplatonism?
It's basically an unfolding of exactly this first encounter. The motive remains constant up to the early 7th century when the Islamic armies from Arabia conquered the Levantine states, Syria, Israel, present Jordan, and Egypt, and blocked the communications between the Greco-Roman world and India for centuries to come. But after that from 330 BC to 630 Christian era, there was a constant exchange. And interestingly, the Indians, the Brahmanic scholars and yogins, were quite well informed about Greek philosophy.
Yeah.
And they agreed on the following. In the conversations reported from this first account of Alexander and his learned circle, that they agreed the cynics are close to them, to their heart, and their practice of poverty, of liberation in any sense. They're close to our Shramanas here. Yes, we like them very much. And then also the Pythagoreans with the idea of cosmic harmonies and inclusion of the body and the focus on that were also close to them. But the most important affinity was perceived by the Indians to the Platonic tradition. And that remained constant over the centuries. And at that point, one may observe that these three traditions also had begun to interact with each other, to mutually influence each other. The Cynics did not have libraries and institutions of learning, as the Platonists had, but their mode of adopting in practice yogic styles of life, forms of life, were also gradually absorbed into the Platonic, Middle Platonic, Neoplatonic tradition. And just for the listeners who are interested in the rationale between this and Christianity, it is quite safe to say, and supported by scholarship, that the form of life of Jesus follows yogic examples to quite an extent. Not purely the example of the Cynics, but it's oriented. There is no form of life of this in Judaism. It is an Indian model that has been adopted, transformed of itinerant teachers living like cynics, but also able to give service, to practice asceticism, and all of this. And this is what Pontius Pilate recognized when he had this views there and said, Master, tell me what is truth, which means you are a philosopher. I assume you're some kind of cynic. Now let us talk about this and let me see how I can get you out of this trouble.
Yeah.
So this was, there is, and if we read this well and use these hermeneutics, we can find that the opening chapter of the Gospel of John is quite similar to the parable of the cave. There is a, if you like it, Platonic and sometimes
Plato's parable of the cave.
Exactly, subtext to be found in the New Testament variously. And the same applies to the development of Christian doctrine. The Holy Trinity is God the Father, the Logos, the ideas, the realm of intellect, the Holy Spirit, the realm of soul, and the pan-matter substance. Jesus Christ, God incarnate, the realm of the body, embodiment, and coming from a common, transcendent source. And in Orthodox theology, the concept of apophaticism is very important. What cannot be spoken, what cannot be conceptualized directly, what is there and emanates from the source, conceptualized as divine energies or taking shape, hypostasis, comes from this source. So the Holy Trinity of Christian concepts of Christian doctrine is quite well founded in this tradition of pagan Platonic thought and integrates it. So we have to regard Christianity as quite a syncretistic religion, drawing from various sources, which makes it not untrue, but more vibrant, more living, more fruitful, as like a living organism.
I just want to stress here also for viewers who may not be aware of this, that very, very early on in Christianity, after Christ's resurrection and ascendance to heaven, the very earliest Christian philosophers, or patristics as they came to be known, grappled with this question, what to make of the salvation of those who came before Christ. Were some of them saved or not? And the answer, more or less, to paraphrase greatly, was, had they sought the truth genuinely, yes, they would be saved. And I personally saw a few years ago in the Orthodox Church at Hierdie, the Greek school in Johannesburg, in the nave of the church, in the entrance, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle's icons sit there because they were venerated from very early on as proto-saints in the Orthodox Church. So it's perhaps for many viewers of our recording here something of a new theme, but Christianity in its foundations were very aware that it was influenced by many traditions, and it saw those traditions on the condition that truth was sought as, shall we say, productive forerunners of Christianity, whose wisdom could be integrated into Christianity, and then, of course, from a Christian viewpoint, taken to a higher level of synthesis.
Yes, we can take even a point further. The idea of logos.
Yeah.
Logos means reason, means word, but more the conceptual word, the idea of it is very close to the Greek concept of idea. And in, like Maximus Confessor, 6th century, 7th century theologian said, and others said too, there is a divine logos in each and every human being. The idea that there is a divine image in the human being by creation was interpreted in Greek terms that there is a divine logos. And in the opening chapter of Gospel of John, it is said, this is already within us, and if we recognize the divine logos in Christ, at this moment we become actively children of God, which means our logos, our divine logos is comes to the fore, begins to become active, and this means that from the time of creation, mythologically spoken, Adam and Eve, up to Abraham and the time of Jesus, there was a continuous presence of the Logos.
Yes.
And forms a manifestation of the divine, which we recognize leading towards this. And interestingly, by the way, to those who are...
And that the Logos becomes flesh in Christ. That's also very important. Yeah.
Yes, and it shines forth in Christ. And what if we understand Christ properly, we do not see, this is an eminent saint for whichever mythical reason has become God on earth, but without proper explanation. But by assuming that the divine Logos shines up eminently and powerfully in Jesus Christ, making him the prime Son of God, which means the prime manifestation of the divine in this world. Now, interestingly, for those who are Protestants, one may say the Roman Catholic Church has made this official doctrine at the Second Vatican Council that there is universal revelation, and Christianity is sort of the topping of it, but there are elements of the divine better unfolded and better understood in other religions. So this should give Protestants a bit of humility. And the second issue is, to those who feel secular and Christianity is just, a closed-minded religion of some outdated edition, the early Christian authors from the time of 1st century right into the 4th and 5th, Clement of Alexandria, Hippolytus of Rome, and others, stated clearly they were well aware of the Brahmanic doctrines of the divine and stated this is one of the roots of Christianity. The three sages who came to, three wise men who came to Bethlehem symbolize that the Babylonian astrological traditions lead to Jesus Christ as manifestation of the divine. And so in Luke, the manifestations of light and other traditions, and these early authors were quite clear that Indian spiritual traditions, philosophy, and practice are one of the sources of Christianity.
And I must stress here the importance of the logos concept, because, again, for the sake of our viewers, the view of those early Christian philosopher theologians was, if we are made in the image of God, a key aspect of that is the logos in us.
Right?
And that's why in the Gospel of John 1 verse 1, if one was to say it more literally, in Afrikaans, it's in the begin was die woord, en die woord was met God, en die woord was God. In the beginning was the word was with God, the word was God. The Greek, of course, the Greek source text uses the word logos. In the beginning was the logos, etc., etc. So the point is that all of us, prior to Christ even, were made in the image of God. And the key to understand this is the logos and how it is exercised, cultivated in various cultures. And that is why, when it was done seeking truth, it was seen in early Christianity as important foundations on which Christianity could build further.
Right.
Yes. So
in continuity,
yes.
And also to those have the idea that the word is the written and solely prophetic word. A word, I might recommend to read the opening chapters of Calvin's Institutes of Christian Theology.
Yes.
They are deeply Platonic,
Yes.
and deeply philosophical, and needs a double reading of it.
Yeah.
And there it is very clear that this logos is not limited to the written word. In antiquity, the written word was only a part of the tradition that encompassed the spoken word, and also the idea word, the word that could only be indicated but never fully explicated.
Yes.
And this means that we should put into the, might even translate word by idea, the divine ideas.
Yes.
It's the conceptual aspect, not the literally written down. This is fundamentalism, and it's too limited.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I want to go to, so we've spoken briefly about the timeline here. We agreed that the transfer, so to speak, of yogic practices to the Greeks start happening with the encounters in Alexander the Great's time with the yogis. We know that this is then taken up into Platonism, Middle Platonism, Neoplatonism. St. Paul was, of course, a Middle Platonist. And that the city of Alexandria, of course, in Egypt, named for the great Emperor Alexander, was a very important center, not only where these yogic practices still continued in the Neoplatonist context, it's also, of course, a key intellectual center of early Christianity, where many of the early Christian thinkers, the so-called church fathers, also encountered this. And as you've already mentioned, I don't want to go into too much historic detail. It was finally formalized in the Orthodox Church in the 1300s due to the example and life and work of Saint Gregory Palamas, born in Thessaloniki in Greece. But I wonder, for a person hearing all these things, they must be curious to, in a sense, have the word become flesh here as well. In your research, you speak about in yogic practice, there are broadly 8 steps towards enlightenment. And these steps should be, I think, understood as results of deepening practice. The emphasis is really here on practice. And you identify 8 similar steps in the hesychast way, of which the outcome is total union with God, explicated by the concept of theosis. In English, deification, in Afrikaans traditionally translated as heiligmaking. Could you just talk us through those 8 steps, how they play out in the yogic tradition and in the hesychast tradition?
Right. Now these 8 steps were conceptualized, by the way, to add this as mysteries. And the Orthodox Church is in the tradition of the divine mysteries,
Yes.
the mysteries of Isis, the mysteries of the Golden Ass, the mysteries of the Oracles of Delphi and other sites where mystery cults were practiced. This means that to enter into spiritual practice, into structured spiritual practice, is also a pathway of transformation.
Yeah.
So the concept of the mysterion has been adopted by the Orthodox Church, and they still regard the services as mysteria, mystery cult, put into practice. And Hesychism was also conceptualized on those lines. The key word here is theurgy. Theurgy means theos, God. Again means to bring into effect, to make work. So divine work, God, human, divine work. This concept is, by the way, picked up from the arts theory of symbolism in late 19th century Russian philosophy. It spread to Germany like Rainer Maria Rilke, and we make an excursus that the Afrikaans poet of law was very much fascinated by this. A good friend of mine, the professor of literature in the Overbach, told me about this quest of law for syncretism and also for these spiritual sources, being fascinated by Rilke and other poets still at the apex of modernity, who sought for something that goes beyond.
And he had a relationship with Sheila Cousins, who was a mystical Catholic.
Yes.
So,
and in this generations, some found their path to Catholicism. So this is highly interesting for modern poetry at the limits, at the apex and the limits of modernity, coming to realize it. In Gottfried Benn, we have this idea, let us recede to our origins to have a new integrated worldview. Again, including the aspects of embodiment, of symbolism, and so on.
Okay, now the 8 steps.
Yes, the 8 steps are, the first 2 steps are the idea that meditation and illumination is not possible without ethical basis.
Ethical basis,
Which means you have certain disciplines, observations to follow, values to follow, like purity of mind, purity of ethical conduct, abstention from greed, asceticism in the more universal sense of limiting yourself to what is needful and helpful and necessary, not to indulge in greed and too much of all of this. And then come around this. And then we come to the next steps, which are of the practical sort. Those are that you begin to include the body. And that means the sitting meditation of Hesychism is a form of asana. And those of you who have done yogas, you know that the Hatha tradition from early Middle Ages has developed a vast array of asanas. Asanas, the postures, have also been described by the first visitors to Brahmanic yogins, and through the centuries, regular visitors there, they described the yogins engaging in asanas. And by the way, the Greeks and the Indians, the Brahmans, agreed that the philosophy was the same, essentially the same, and became ever more similar. But the Indians had something the Greeks did not have, that was the structured practice of yoga. So the asanas are a feature. The Hesychism doesn't have complex asanas, but its postures, its form of breathing, the bodily aspects of it can all be described as asanas. And then we have the next step, which is the breathing meditation, the pranayama. Prana means essentially the Holy Spirit, a fine matter substance, like divine breath, which can be induced into the body by means of breathing. So the breathing practice of yoga, like to inhale, and with the inhaling of breath, you also inhale the prana, the healing, transformative, empowering, subtle energy, breath of God, and induce it into the body. Then you have the retention to let it spread in the body all over, from the heart, in the belly, through all aspects, which was developed in Tantra, and Hesychism has definite tantric features, interestingly. And then you exhale, and you may have a converse energetic process of Kundalini, of your own vital energies, vital spiritual energies that are raised by the inhaling and the complementary movement. And then you have this aspect of certain energetic nodes of the body that's very important. The heart is conceptualized in Christianity. Catholics like the heart, Christianity is religion of the heart. It's important in ancient Egyptian anthropology, the heart of the prime seat of the person, and where thought, emotion, and body are connected. Likewise, in Indian philosophy of yoga too, the heart has an immanent role, and then the belly to the center of the body. This is why the Hesychasts were also nicknamed as belly gazers. Yes, please.
Just want to clarify this. So the concept of the heart in both the yoga tradition and then in the Hesychastic tradition is a metaphor for the integration of mind, soul, and body.
It is a metaphor, and it is yet also real. It was indeed thought that the physical heart is also seat of the emotional heart and
Yes,
of the mental.
of course.
And there you have the relation between these arms.
Okay.
And the other, so the other chakra is that of the navel region, while the Hesychasts were nicknamed the navel gazers.
Navel gazers.
And they had complex practices of energetic processes deriving from Hesychast meditation.
Yeah, I can just mention as a matter of interest again for the viewers. Before I myself discovered the Orthodox tradition, I was a Zen monk for 8 years.
Yes.
And when you teach somebody meditation in Zen, it's very important to have a proper meditation cushion, crossing the legs so that you open the diaphragm. As they taught me, pushing up the sky with the crown of your head, which straightens your spine, okay, and allows the breathing to flow easily. And then you look at about 45 degrees in front of you to the ground, okay, and that you should concentrate when breathing out to follow the breath until it pushes out in your navel, i.e. you're opening up your diaphragm, and then again also follow it as it stops here on the top. And then what in Hesychast prayer happens is there is a harmonization between the prayer and the breathing. So when you breathe in, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, and breathing out, have mercy on me, the sinner. Okay, which is of course the prayer of the publican.
Perfect.
That Christ taught people. So there is an idea here that once the posture, you've taken care now of, shall we say, excessive desires, so that you can focus on the body. You don't sit there with a hangover, for example, or a drug trip. You're in reality. You're in the correct posture where you can properly harmonize with the breathing so that you can harmonize with the prayer, so that you can deepen unity with the divine. This is the essential idea. Yeah. Okay. Now, and that's why from where they spoke of the navel gazing, your gaze is dropped in the direction of the navel. Then there's step number 5.
Then we have the next step. It's not a sequence of temporal, sometimes yes, but the next aspect is that of the withdrawal from too much sensory distraction.
Yes.
From noise, from whatever. So you have the movement of the attention and thought and what is beyond thought into the center, and the center is also always conceptualized in Vedanta and in Platonic tradition as also having a divine core.
Yes.
So by this retention, you move through your own layers of personality to the koshas, through your own introspection of the soul into what is the divine core.
Right.
And that is done outwardly in silence in this meditation, and then the next step is, which we described, is the binding of attention to a point of focus, which can be either the navel like this, or it's 45 degrees, and also the invocation of Christ, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy upon the sinner, represents a certain tantric tradition of the incessant prayer and focus on the embodied aspect of the divine, your personal Lord, Jesus Christ, or in Tantra, this or that manifested avatar of the divine as your personal Lord. This is the binding to the representation of the divine, be it in form and shape, or be it formless and shapeless. And then you have the meditation in stillness, which is approaching the union, called Advaita consciousness, not dual anymore, to arrive at the sense of presence of the divine, that something is beginning to work on you, and also as in an inverted perspective, that no longer you yourself are the agent, but that the transcendent begins to act in you and through you.
Yeah.
And then you come to the 8th step, which is the samadhi, which is the culmination, the fulfillment, the experience of union, which may be conceptualized as grace, and grace essentially means that it is a gift. You experience it as a gift, and this perspective of that, of being a recipient of something, also means relinquish your claim that you can do anything. It's a key word of modern conceptualizations of yoga: mind control, body control, control of whatnot ever. And this is a very empty and totalitarian concept too. 20th century is about universal control, and this control is essentially destructive. Here, the perspective of grace opens itself up, that you are on the recipient side, and this grace is overabundant, as the popular Orthodox philosophy concept, which is repeated in Orthodox liturgy so many times. The overabundant comes to you, and there you experience divine. And this state is said to be, as by Shankara, the eminent Vedantic philosopher in the 8th century, in his commentary on the yoga commentaries, he states there visions of divine light occur. And the same is in Hesychism, and described by late Neoplatonists too, by Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism. His visions and experiences of divine light were perceived by others, on Proclus, and another eminent author and teacher of Neoplatonism in the 5th century. And the Hesychists also claim that at that point you arrive at manifestations of the divine light. And now this divine light is eminently described with two examples in biblical scripture. The one is Moses, when he came down from the mountain. His face shone with a radiance that was hard to stand. So Moses veiled his face. He had encountered the divine in the cloud, which means in the divine darkness. And from the divine darkness emerges that radiant light.
Yeah.
And there's a hymn, Hail Gladsome Light, which is one of the oldest hymns of Christianity, to Force the warm, the blissful light. And this blissful light is described in yoga too. Now, the Hesychist controversy, by the way, in the 14th century, was ignited by a debate on what is this vision of light. There were rationalist critics who said, oh, this is just a bodily infatuation of monks who have meditated too much or whatnot.
What we today would call auto-suggestion.
Right. And this was defended, and with sound roots in the Platonic tradition, that there is indeed such a spiritual light, and in its purest form, the most brilliant form, it is a divine light.
And that's also on the story of the Mount Tabor.
Exactly.
Transfiguration of the mountain, verheerliking of the berg.
And there you have it. It's not a singular erratic event, but it is understood that under special conditions, with those three disciples considered to be capable of such perceptions, they, for some moments, perceive this Christ appear in this divine light. There are beautiful icons who depict this divine light as being distinct from the light of the day, and it is also an inner light. In 2 Peter, we have this inner light, and we keep it and guard it till the day, the final day comes, till the day comes when the star rises. So this is deeply Hesychist, and this also is important because it integrates this event of Mount Tabor into philosophy and makes it a university access.
Yes.
And Orthodoxy states it's not a singular event in Illo Tempore, the time of mythical events, but it is a paradigm to the Orthodox and to the practitioners of Hesychism. It is a universal image to be reactualized.
Yeah, so what we are confronted here with, unlike so much modern manifestations of religion, which understands belief as just assent to a set of proposals.
Mm-hmm.
It's a rationalistic assent to a set of proposals. What you have here is not only an assent, but it is a total surrender, which is deeply anchored in intense physical practice.
Mm-hmm.
And the philosophy around this is that as you, in a sense, attend more to it, pay more close attention to it, you are opening yourself up more to its transformative practice. And in its most extreme forms, there are those rare people who've experienced what is then known as the divine light. Now, You made an interesting reference in your research, we've already touched upon it, to what you call this ternary anthropology, triadic anthropology, mind, body, soul, in which, to my best knowledge, I'm not aware that it has been done previously formally in Orthodox theology and philosophy. But you equated mind, body, and soul with Father, Son, and Spirit. Could you just explain that to
Well,
us?
that's very tentative, and I would need
Tentative,
more
of
research to support this,
Yeah.
to validate that historically. But it makes sense in terms of a Platonic and Neoplatonic thought. So we may leave it as a
Yes.
plausible
Yes.
hypothesis here. A point also to make is certainly that hesychism is very much alive. To those of the listeners, if you have time and enjoy it, there is a film, modern, of 2006 by Pavel Lungin. It's called The Island, Ostrov, The Island.
A Russian film, yeah.
A Russian film with subtitles accessible on YouTube, which is not exactly about hesychism, but there are hesychist elements in the gifted lay monk, who is the hero of this film. It's a very, very beautiful film with symbols of hesychism and the powers of this monk, of clairvoyance, of deep insight into the soul, of also spiritual combat, are well depicted. It's prized internationally, so you will find it on YouTube. Advertisement, The Island, Ostrov.
Yeah.
And there comes an aspect of hesychism too, that is that of exorcism. It's not taken for serious in much of modern thought, and it's a very strange phenomenon that people who identify as secular will indulge gleefully in all sorts of satanic symbolisms and practices them as obscenity, as provocative, and whatever. There is an infantile aspect to it, but it's as if there were remnants of some sort of spiritual connections by acting the bad boy and
Yes.
and all sorts of blasphemous public actions, whatever. But it is the wisdom of hesychism, and hesychist theology by Palamas explains that the divineness does not only manifest itself in word and insight and ethical commandment, but also in energies.
Yes.
And there is a primary sense in Orthodoxy that there are spiritual energies. These energies interact with the psychological. That's the theme of this film, by the way.
Yes.
That there is indeed something, which you call it satanic or not, Satan is a bit of a mythological figure, put it darker energies in esoteric terms. Esotericism has rediscovered this, which makes esotericism very important, that there are destructive dark energies which manifest themselves in all forms of secular, the love of whatnot ever that is dark.
Yeah.
But it also acts on the soul. So one can observe that people sometimes with the conditions of, for instance, medium depression, also have imbibed too much of negative energies. And that reinforces a destructive process in the soul itself. And it's hard to get people out of this doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And hesychists have been counselors of the soul, psychological counselors, and they have a keen sense of the light.
Yes.
And one can observe that those who manage to access this divine light find themselves transformed to their own surprises. Sometimes there's something, a radiance of beauty and warmth that shines from them once this blanket of negative energies is removed or limited. So hesychists have also been excellent, call them exorcists or spiritual guides, and also those who could transform the reality.
I want to stress here again for viewers who may not be aware of it. I believe it's Saint Augustine who first theorized this, but it became more entrenched in the Orthodox tradition through the work of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, or sometimes known as Pseudo Dionysius, according to which evil has no existence of its own. So God did not create evil, but evil is that which parasites upon and perverts the good, and especially energies. Yeah.
Yes.
And this is a very important thing, is that we can observe today also in modern psychology, as you said already, in this sort of folklore expression of negative energy, but it carries great truth. So that if if energy is canalized in a deliberately dark way, it can be very, very destructive to ourselves, to our psyches, our bodies, our relations with other people. But what the Hesychast tradition teaches us is that if the energy is concentrated deliberately on the divine, personified by the Logos, it's the embodied Logos of Christ, it is not only deeply healing, but it can lead the practitioner to healing of others.
Exactly.
Discerning.
Yes.
And so, in a sense, you can say, like so many other things that became famous in modernity, this is the true roots of modern psychology that we're talking of.
By the way, Carl Gustav Jung was very much aware of that. And
very much. Jung was very much
Jung,
aware.
interestingly, was deeply steeped in well, partly from pietism, from his pastoral ancestors. His father was a pastor too, but also in esotericism. His maternal grandfather engaged in mediumistic practice.
Yes.
And these things.
Spiritism.
Now, this thing about evil, the origin of evil is described in all mythologies of the world. There's a wonderful book to recommend by Michael J. Witzel, The Origin of World Mythologies. The Origin of World Mythologies, 720 pages by an eminent Indologist, Michael Witzel. Right. And the essence of it is that evil is a necessary aspect of freedom. Without freedom, there would be no evil, but without freedom, there would be no creation, no dynamics of the world. So the fall from paradise into the dynamics of time also involves evil, death, and darkness, and limitation, and all that.
Yes.
So this idea of paradise is nothing that can be institutionalized in this world. This would be terror, the freezing of the world into a system, and the messianic philosophies of the 20th century, like Marxism, to attain a final state of a
they want to systematize paradise here.
Exactly.
And that leads to terror and violence.
Yes, and the allegedly perfect society, perfect state, the paradisic state, turns into terror. So this dynamic has to be accepted.
Yeah.
And within this dynamic, the quest for light has to come.
Yeah, and I want to stress, it always strikes me, as you know, we are now in Orthodox Lent. And on the Sundays, we do the liturgy not of St. John Chrysostomus, but that of St. Basil of Caesarea, one of the great church fathers. And there is a long prayer in there in which essentially the whole narrative of Christianity is summed up in 2 pages. And what St. Basil makes very clear there, and I'm paraphrasing this great thinker, is that paradise is a state, it's a condition, it's not a place beyond this world, world. And that the condition in which we live now is the condition where we long for the paradise that we lost in the fall, where we try to be God. Yeah. And so the important thing also in the Orthodox tradition, Christ is understood as the second Adam. So what went wrong in Adam choosing against God by trying to replace God with knowledge or divine knowledge, that set off a catastrophe, and Christ then begins to restore that gap that occurred. And what the Hesychast does, the Hesychast practitioner, in striving to become an icon of the divine Logos, is to restore the paradisiac state, at least internally, and that it radiates through you. But it can never be in this world a complete state unless, if of course, into eschatological theology and so on, speaking of a new heaven and earth and so on. But that's not the purpose of our discussion here today. But that the paradisiac is restored in this state of intense stillness and love.
Right, and this is a structural feature of Orthodox theology and Platonism, by the way, too, and also of Hesychism, to live with that which is beyond. To have the sense that the foundation, like paradise or the divine source, is necessarily transcendent. It's a state lost, which means it's before the emergence of things in our world, but we can relate to them by what emanates from them, what shines, what radiates from them, be it light, or a very important aspect of Hesychum is fire.
Yes.
And it's interesting that this image of fire as an aspect of the divine is very strong in Orthodoxy, also in Hesychism, and Pentecostals also discover it with fire of the whatever not. It's the energetic aspect. And if you think of about cosmological, now symbolic cosmology, the southern point of South America is called Tierra del Fuego, the land of fires.
Yes.
And this is not because the Indians had a few fires there, but it's also at the realms, at the limits, at the outer boundaries, south of Patagonia. You have the place where you encounter fires
Yes.
of a transcendent sort, which also have immanent aspects. So the idea that fire has its illuminative aspect, its energetic aspects, and its empowering aspects too. And this fire was sought, by the way, by medieval monks, and there's quite a tradition of female spirituality in the Middle Ages.
Ja, Hildegard of Bingen is it?
Pardon me?
Hildegard of Bingen?
Hildegard von Bingen wrote about it. Mechthild von Magdeburg.
Yes.
She wrote in Low German, which is quite close to Dutch. We may even consider if Elise and Abelard also
Yes.
had this, and there is something like a double reading comes. We know about the relationship between Elise and Abelard. They seem to have made a relation between what they thought intellectually, the divine illumination of the mind, but also the fire of the soul. And inevitably, it also touches on the erotic aspects.
Yes.
And this is an issue that is in the Hesychist tradition, and to be researched further, that St. Mary of Egypt is the prime example, 4th century, of the transformation of the erotic to the spiritual.
Yes.
To tell briefly, she was a very feeling, very sensuous girl who ran away from home at age 12, lived by weaving, lived a very voluptuous life, a libidinous life, and at some point, something brought her to go to Palestine, and there she experienced a transformation of her libidinal energies into spiritual ones.
Yeah.
And this made her radiant. It brought her into a deep connection with nature, by the way. Mm. And when her earthly days then ended afterwards, she called for a saint to visit her. She told him her life, so her vita has been preserved. But she's an eminent example of this link between the libido, as Carl Gustav Jung also conceptualized the spiritual aspects, and also the spiritual. Yeah. And that's fascinating also for our present conceptualization of these things. We are not as prudish maybe as centuries before us, and certainly not as in the way of secular Calvinists, Lutherans or Catholics, whichever. There is a deeper connection, and that limits sensuality too, and relates it to the spiritual, and lets sensuality flourish in a way that is also spiritual.
But I must stress that you may be aware of the German Korean philosopher Byung-Chul Han, who's published a lot. He's based in Berlin. He's published a lot the past 15 years. And in one of his recent books, Vita Contemplativa, he also refers to our age as a truly pornographic age. It's pornographic because the erotic is instrumentalized, obviously, for titillation and stimulation and so on. But also in the sense that we live in a time where we take exhibitionism of the private on social media to levels unheard of. And it just seems to me, that we also need to stress here that the erotic, without aiming at something higher, becomes the pornographic. And also that what we're discussing here freely is normally treated in the Orthodox tradition and in the yoga tradition as mysteries. Mysteries. It's
Yes,
not.
exactly.
It's things that you are initiated into by masters. It's not as, you know, both of us are cultural Protestants. It's not the first impulse to go and read a book or watch a YouTube video. You have to be initiated by masters into this tradition. And I cannot help but to think of a very, very beautiful thing that the great Yunoshiro Tanizaki, the Japanese author, said. Because so much of modern literature is also very pornographic. It shows the details of sex or murder in the greatest horrifying detail, and that's called pushing boundaries. And Tanizaki already said nearly 80 years ago, isn't it always better for things to be hinted at? Just a hint. And that I find so beautiful. And so I think this is the closing question I want to get to, Ullrich. We've had a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion, but I think for both of us, my own journey via Buddhism to Orthodoxy, yours via the yogic tradition to Orthodox theology, it stemmed from deep personal longing. We are moderns who had that longing. And I'd like to ask you in closing, if you consider that we live in such a pornographic world where it is instrumentalized and so on, what hope is there for modern people to recover it? Or should we say that the fact that our culture is so drenched in the erotic is maybe an indication of how massively widespread the longing is? But it seems to me the challenge is people don't realize where to look. I'd like your comment on that in closing.
Gladly so. Gladly so. We can observe that times spiritual philosophy or practice are at its peak. There is also a distinct element of eroticism. The early pietists were quite strong stories of eros, and there is in the hymns of this 18th century.
Oh yes,
the spiritual and the erotic are deeply mutually compatible and reinforce each other.
The Afrikaans church historian Christina Landman did fascinating research in a book called The Piety of Afrikaans Women on how often Afrikaans women in this period, 18th century pietism, had a quasi-erotic relationship to Christ in their longing.
You have it in German tradition. Count Zinzendorf was deeply erotic and deeply spiritual.
Yes.
And the most beautiful Lutheran hymns combine exactly this. So in terms of mythical geography, fire is a very ancient element of it's in Vedic ritual, sacred fire, the Agni. The Agni Puja in Slavic culture, which is, if you visit the Russia and the Ukraine, you know this is Orthodox, it's sensuous, and it's spiritual, and it's esoteric too. All of these are deeply united and very close to nature. So it's in a way, take the metaphor of the land of fire, to venture, put it in Afrikaans, die reis naar die land van vuren. En daar aan die grens, die vuren te ontdek, en die vuren in hulle erotische en hulle spirituele aspect en ook illuminating. And this is decidedly postmodern, so we can make a claim that secularism goes along with pornography.
It does.
Pornography is an expression of secularism.
It is.
Of the greed, of the doom, the thrall of death, that is there. We even have it a bit, like, think of Breitenbach, who in his spiritual journey came to the point of Buddhism, sometimes playing with, sometimes serious, but he doesn't get to the point of integrating the spiritual with the erotic.
Maybe in the later work, but that's another discussion.
That is an interesting discussion too, which makes us aside. The mythical geography of Hesychism is in some way related to that, or might be related, of Afrikaans culture too, to venture into the realms of otherness, into the mythology of other people, to integrate that into their own culture. This is what happened in Alexandria, which was the prime node of interchange between Egypt, which is a part of African culture, Greek, and Indian thought, and here in the long pagan Christian coexistence, Christian doctrine was formed. Christianity is in a sense a pagan religion, and inspiringly so.
Yeah.
And the culture of that realm also dealt, by the way, with the elements of eroticism. Think of the Golden Ass, which is the travel from a pretty loose, free-living young lover to become a spiritual person.
Yes.
And the erotic is integrated into the spiritual there. It's a mystical transformation that finds itself in the life of quite a few Hesychast saints, but they have retained some of this fire. It's about the illumination of the light and about the fire.
Yeah.
And this is what is postmodern. I think it fascinates both of us, being in many ways Orthodox thinkers, theologians, myself a Lutheran, but nevertheless also engaged in Orthodox scholarship, and with post-secular itineraries that lead us to yoga and also to Orthodoxy to discover how much there is. And this is, by the way, something for Orthodoxy itself. There are Orthodox nutheads too, to put it this way, very fundamentalist people, but there are these inspiring philosophers who discover the essence and the postmodern significance of Hesychast thought for the arts and symbolist movement. Rilke was deeply attached, deeply inspired by the spiritual and the erotic, and bring that into a union in his early poems inspired by the Russian experience. It's a program for our ages and our times.
Yeah, it's and I must agree with you in closing that I think in a more Afrikaans context, Afrikaans literature, even from the very early days with Eugene Marie's Bushman stories, there's a long tradition of dabbling in other traditions, the Buddhist, the Catholic, etc. And so it's the traces of this have been with us for a very long time. And as Karel Schoeman said, we should only follow the voices. Ullrich, thank you very much.
Ek sê maar baie dankie.
Baie dankie. Pragtig geweest. Thank you.
Baie dankie aan die luisteraars en groete aan almal wat hierdie luister het met geduld.
Thank you.